Hello, this is a lesson read aloud for Lesson 4.05 New Politics. Lesson 4.04 was the discussion, so please make sure that you have done your initial posts for the discussion activity and then be checking back for response posts and to make response posts on your discussion so you can earn a good grade on your discussion activity for Lesson 4.04. But now on to 405, New Politics. The presidential election of 1824 was a very close race. When the votes were counted and no candidate had won a majority of the electoral vote, and even though Andrew Jackson won a plurality, John Quincy Adams became the new president. Andrew Jackson and his followers were determined to win the election of 1828, and he campaigned as the man of the people. In the process, the modern American political campaign was born. Okay, goals for our lesson today. Identify Andrew Jackson as the first common man elected president. Explain how Jackson was able to be elected in 1828. Describe what is meant by the term Jacksonian democracy and the policies and practices associated with Jackson. Explain how John Quincy Adams became president and how his election affected his presidency. Assess Andrew Jackson's election in 1828 and its long-term effects. Describe the American electorate of the 1820s and how it had changed since 1800. Now, be sure when you're reading and when you're going through all the activities, do not get Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson confused. I find that happens. Students get confused between Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy. So be very careful that you're not getting them mixed up. Okay, for today, we're reading pages 280 through 288. Reading guide, completing 2 different elections activity, which is optional, and complete and submit the graded assignment. But we are not, note, we are not doing this 4.05 graded assignment. So don't worry about the graded assignment for this lesson. We're just doing the reading. Okay, page 280, so we have a timeline, and it's a very political looking timeline because it's dealing with the presidency. We do have the Indian Removal Acts, which we'll also read about in the Trail of Tears, Nullification Acts, and the Panic of 1837. So we're dealing with some presidential and economic things on this timeline here. A new kind of politics, Jacksonian democracy. Colonel Thomas Meacham of Sandy Creek, New York, was a great admirer of President Andrew Jackson. Meacham was so fond of the president that in the fall of 1835, he decided to bestow upon him a unique gift, a giant block of cheddar cheese. Weighing 1,400 pounds and measuring 4 feet in diameter and 2 feet in thickness, the presidential cheddar was ringed by a national belt upon which were inscribed the words, "Our Union, may it be preserved." It took a team of 24 horses to haul the enormous wheel of cheese from upstate New York to its new home in Washington, D.C. Uncertain of what to do with this unusual gift, Jackson let it sit in the White House for more than a year, where it had a chance to age properly. Finally, on February 22, 1837, George Washington's birthday, President Jackson, just weeks before he left office, opened the door of the White House to the general public for a celebration. With members of the cabinet and the Congress by his side, the president invited his fellow citizens to feast on the hulking mass of cheddar. "All you heard was cheese," wrote one guest. "All you smelled was cheese." Within 2 hours, the crowd demolished the cheddar sculpture, leaving in its wake muddied carpets, broken china, and general mayhem. The story of the giant cheese was emblematic of the new political culture in the 1830s. In the place of decorum and office holding by educated men and means, there was a system of energetic popular participation and cheese. Ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, mechanics, wage laborers got the vote and turned out in record numbers at the polls. They assumed a leading role in election and gave life to a system of well-organized political parties, appealing to potential supporters through voting, songs, rallies, newspapers, and elaborate torchlight rallies. While many viewed the years of Jackson's presidency as an important step in the march of democratic civilization, others lamented, as one contemporary put it, the horrible doctrine influence of Jacksonianism. Love it or hate it, there was little denying that American public life in the age of Jackson looked nothing like the country or world had seen before. This new rashly egalitarian world was one that the Founding Fathers never intended. Even Thomas Jefferson, who had written All Men Are Created Equal, had observed that a choice by the people themselves is not generally distinguished for its wisdom. In the age of Jackson, however, leaders not only turned to the people for guidance, but invited them over for a midday snack. This new egalitarian spirit has its limits. It did not embrace African Americans, Native Americans, or women. The nation persisted in a contradiction, priding itself on its democratic nationalism while excluding many of its people from the benefits of citizenship in a democracy. Nevertheless, while the limitations of Jacksonian democracy are evident by present-day standards, the era was remarkable for the spread of democratic participation. From natural aristocracy to common man. The generation of the Founding Fathers was democratic for its time. It included lawyers who had been sons of farmers, a printer born the son of a candle maker, brewers and silversmiths, recent immigrants, and southern planters who expanded their once modest holdings. John Adams predicted that someday new claims will arise and women will demand a vote, and every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other. But he did not mean to suggest that such a development would be a good thing. On the contrary, he dreaded the possibility that America's natural aristocracy, an aristocracy of talent, not birth, would give way to what he called the common herd of mankind. The founders did not look forward to the possibility that their republic, in which the leaders were drawn from the well-educated and the well-off, would become an unruly democracy in which leaders emerged from the masses, the vast majority of common people. But after the War of 1812, voter participation rose and more white men gained the franchise, or the right to vote. The trend began in the West when leaders of new states like Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama wanted to attract new settlers. They wrote constitutions that eliminated landholding requirements for voting, in the hope that settlers would move to places where they enjoyed a greater say in government. In turn, older states on the eastern seaboard revised their laws in an attempt to keep their citizens at home. Rendering it the interest and happiness of our population to stay at home, wrote one advocate of extending voting rights in New York, is the only way to check the emigration rage. In the decade following the War of 1812, in addition to westward expansion, economic development encouraged lawmakers to extend the franchise. In New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, more men and women were working in ports, factories, and city jobs. Many did not own land. They paid taxes but were not eligible to vote. Ambitious politicians soon realized that they could strengthen their own electoral base by supporting these workers' rights to vote. By 1821, 21 of the 24 states in the Union had adopted universal suffrage, the unrestricted right to vote for white men. Even though women, African Americans, and Native Americans were not part of this expanded political participation, by the early 1820s, America's increasingly diverse population had a large and growing say in politics. In this emerging world of mass democracy, democracy in which the office holding was decided by many voters, anyone with a vote mattered. And many people could vote. Though most Americans focused first on state and local politics, voters also had their eyes on the presidential election of 1824, which would select the successor to James Monroe. From Adams to Jackson. In the presidential election of 1824, the candidate most qualified for the presidency was John Quincy Adams, the eldest son of former President John Adams and his wife Abigail. John Quincy Adams had spent much of his youth in Paris and Russia. He has served as the official secretary to the American mission in St. Petersburg. He had been tutored in Latin, Greek, and law by his father, and learned much about literature, science, and the arts from his father's colleague and friend, Thomas Jefferson. At the time, he was only a teenager. Upon his return to Boston, Adams attended Harvard University and became a successful attorney. As his father's political career drew to a close, John Quincy Adams embarked on his own life of public service. He served in the United States Senate and the United States Ambassador to Prussia, the Netherlands, Russia, and Great Britain. He was Secretary of State for James Monroe. Fluent in several languages and acquainted with most of the major European leaders, Adams was one of his country's most learned and worldly men. He had no enthusiasm for the emerging mass democracy, but he was an advocate of strong national government to spur growth. Adams appeared to be the front runner for the presidency in 1824. Also in the running in 1824 were several members of Adams' Democratic-Republican Party, by that time the only real party left standing. The Secretary of the Treasury in James Monroe's cabinet, William Crawford, a Georgian and a states' right advocate, sought the presidency. So did Henry Clay of Kentucky, the outspoken nationalist then serving as Speaker of the House of Representatives. In the western states, Clay competed for support with the former Indian fighter and hero of the Battle of New Orleans, the plain-spoken Jackson, and Senator Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. The gruff, plain-spoken Jackson struck a sharp contrast with the Eastern-born, well-heeled Adams. There was no real competition from a Federalist candidate. Indeed, due to the slow but steady decline of the Federalists as a party, there had not been a serious contested presidential race since 1800. Okay, let's just quickly look up here, race and suffrage. Even as most states extended the franchise to all adult white men, several of those states, namely Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and New York, took away or tightened voting rights for black men. Having eliminated slavery, most northern states were uncertain of what to do with the free black population. Ultimately, they decided that while black people should not be held in bondage, neither should they vote or hold office. As for the new western states, from the beginning, they excluded African Americans from the electorate. Every state that entered the Union after 1819 prohibited blacks from voting. The rise of the common man in the age of Andrew Jackson went hand in hand with the increasing tendency to exclude some people on the basis of race. All right, back down here to the deal for the presidency. In 1824, more Americans were able to vote than in previous presidential elections. The end result of this 1824 election was a four-way split, with Jackson winning a plurality, or the greatest single number of votes, but no candidate winning an outright majority in the Electoral College. According to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, when no candidate receives a majority of electoral votes, then the members of the House of Representatives vote among themselves to select the president. In the first round of voting in the House, Jackson won a plurality of the electoral vote, but fell short of a majority. Behind the scenes, House Speaker Henry Clay used his influence with fellow congressmen to sway votes to Adams and away from Jackson. Clay and Jackson had clashed well before 1824. Clay had sharply criticized Jackson for marching into Florida in 1818, at the time Spanish territory, where Jackson executed 2 British officers suspected of encouraging Indian attacks, and dealt brutally with the Seminoles. Speaking in the Hush House of Representatives in 1819, Clay denounced Jackson as a dangerous military despot in the making. Remember, the Greeks had her Alexander, Rome had her Caesar, England her Cromwell, France her Bonaparte, and that if we would escape the rock on which they split, we must avoid their errors. Jackson never forgave him. In 1824, Clay's influence finally secured a narrow electoral victory for John Quincy Adams. A few days later, the president-elect offered the powerful post of Secretary of State to Clay. Jackson was quick to accuse Clay and Adams of making a deal behind closed doors. "I weep for the liberty of my country," cried Jackson. "The Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive 30 pieces of silver," he complained. "His end will be the same. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before?" While it is unlikely that Clay and Adams struck an explicit deal prior to the House of Representatives vote, Adams' administration was denounced for its corrupt bargain with Clay. It infuriated Jackson, and a partisan press excited the passions of many ordinary Americans who would turn to Jackson for political leadership. Though John Quincy Adams' term in office was 4 years long, almost from the day he assumed the presidency, he was running against great odds and amid terrible public fury. Okay, I think I'm going to stop this one here, and we'll catch up at the next recording with A Presidency Derailed and the Rise of Popular Politics.